I wake most mornings before the sun reaches over the ash trees and lays its thin gold across the kitchen linoleum. Not because I am eager to get on with the day, but because the house has grown used to the pattern of my footsteps and will not settle until it hears them. And in the quiet that follows, I make coffee the way Alice taught me half a century ago, with the kettle rattling on the back burner, the scoop a little too generous, the first breath of steam lifting the scent of something warm and faithful into a room that has survived wallpaper trends, grandchildren with sticky hands, and the long winter of her illness. I do it slowly, almost ceremonially, setting the cup on the table where she used to sit with her crosswords and half-smiles, and I wait for the click of the baseboard heaters, the distant drone of a commuter bus, the small confirmations that the world is still moving, even if I prefer not to. At 76, a man learns that the morning is his truest companion. There is patience in it, and the coffee is a soft browning of memory that makes the first swallow hurt in exactly the right way, reminding me that I loved and was loved. And then, like every other husband who wears his ring long after the doctor closes the door, I was left to tidy the cups and turn the lights off by myself. Our split level sits 3 blocks from the Lutheran church and 2 from the high school, where Jared once fouled out of a game and said all the referees were blind, a performance that made Alice bite the inside of her cheek to keep from laughing. And if you stand on the porch, you can still see the maple Jared climbed to avoid mowing the lawn, which he conquered only when I threatened to turn the mower into a sculpture on our front lawn and call it modern art, a notion Alice declared the one joke Milwaukee will not forgive. The neighborhood has aged gently, the way Midwestern things do, with polite fences and petunias in their little municipal boxes. And on Wednesdays, if I drive with the window down, I can catch the wet cardboard smell of the bowling alley and hear the same jukebox that played when we were young. While on Thursdays, I leave the car at home and walk to the Polish deli for ham that is sliced so thin it falls into soft folds like handkerchiefs. People are kind if you give them the chance, and most days they do, but kindness is not the same as closeness. The paper arrives with headlines that speak of other people's tragedies, and I return the favor with coupons clipped in a precise hand and stacked on the countertop. And if the cashier calls me Hun, which she often does, it's sweet as honey and just as impossible to live on. The rooms are faithful yet greedy, each the steward of 1,000 small relics that I have not found the courage to sort. And if you think grief looks like black suits and casseroles, you have not met the version that hides in routine, that asks you every afternoon whether you will reheat soup or pretend you meant to eat crackers, that keeps the television volume low so you can hear the phone not ring, that catalogs the sound of your own breath because it is the only other living thing you can count on after 7 in the evening. I have done the responsible things. I threw away the chemotherapy brochures, donated 2 winter coats, reset the clocks, and taught myself to use the microwave without turning every pot roast into the Sahara. But I have not been able to move the jewelry box on the bedroom dresser, the lacquered one with the little ballerina who turns when you wind her, slightly off pitch now, the tinny melody of a past that insists on being heard. I told Jared it would remain, that his mother's things were not a bank account or a yard sale, and he told me that of course he understood, that he just wanted to make sure everything was managed, a word that always arrives with a folder and leaves with a signature. And I nodded because I was tired and because fathers, even retired ones, still want to hear their sons speaking the language of adulthood. After Alice's funeral, he started dropping by, not on Sundays, but on Tuesdays, always allegedly between meetings, a habit that tends to disguise the fact that he was checking on me or on my checkbook. And he would sigh as he looked over the utility bills as if the city had wronged us both, and then he would skillfully move the conversation toward tuition, interest rates, the difficulty of refinancing, the cruelty of car engines which have become conspirators in the modern robbery of honest men. I am not blind to the world he moves in. He is 48 now, with the harried competence of a man who can send an email while pretending to listen to a child describe a drawing. And sometimes I want to shake him and say that the point of the drawing is not the cow or the tree or the purple sun, but the invitation to inhabit the mind of the person you love just for a minute, without fixing or arranging or calculating the cost. He married a kind woman who has learned to ration her kindness, and together they had a daughter named Lila, who, when she was small, would sit on the kitchen counter with her bare feet knocking rhythm into the cabinets and ask for tiny sips of grown-up coffee. And I would give her a spoonful of milk froth and call it a latte, and Alice would laugh in that soft, contained way that made me feel we had discovered a private theater. Lila is a woman now, at least in the photographs, with a carefully curated smile and a fiancé whose teeth appear to have their own real estate agent. And I try not to resent that I have become, in the family's public story, a charming addendum, a flavoring, the sense of heritage that makes a slideshow land with a respectable thud. When she called to tell me the date of the wedding, I pressed the phone to my ear like a seashell and tried to hear the ocean of her childhood inside it. The puddles she jumped, the braids Alice wove, the sunburn we soothed with vinegar and patience, and for a moment I almost succeeded. I still drive, cautiously and with both hands, to the cemetery every other week. The roses from the grocery store wrapped in damp paper towels, because for the price of a bouquet and a little gas, I can be the man I promised to be, the one who shows up. And I clean the stone with the corner of my handkerchief until Alice knew she would have found funny or sad, or most often ridiculous. I told her about the city voting on whether food trucks should be allowed within a certain number of feet from a brick-and-mortar restaurant, a phrase so carefully constructed to disguise old fear that she would have quoted it back to me with an arched eyebrow. I told her about a new neighbor who invented a more efficient bird feeder and is either a genius or a lunatic depending on the judge. I told her that the summer storms have learned to make a sound, like an old record player being plugged in, and that each time thunder rattles the windows, I still look for her silhouette in the hallway, because for years she was the one who remembered to pull the plug on the toaster when lightning got too friendly. I do not mention to her that after the services ended, I sat on the bed for an hour and held her sweater to my face until the scent of her skin yielded to the discouraging neutrality of clean cotton. And even now, 2 years later, when I open the closet, I worry that the air will be too honest with me and tell me she is entirely gone. If you inventory the objects that feel like my life, you would begin with the ring on my finger and end with a set of screwdrivers in a red metal box. And somewhere in between, you would pause at the jewelry box because it sits at the center of a map I do not show anyone. Alice wore the pieces the way some women wear their laugh, without apology and with an accuracy that made you take her seriously, even when she was teasing. The sapphire ring had the color of the Lake Michigan sky on the October day we were married, and I told her so too many times, which is probably why she'd lift her hand to her ear as if testing an invisible wind vane and say, "Forecast, one sentimental husband." There is a brooch shaped like a leaf that she pinned to the lapel of her winter coat and a pendant with a tiny scratch from the time Jared, age 10 and furious, discovered gravity by slamming his bedroom door into her shoulder. There are earrings she kept on the dresser so she would not forget them, and still, once, walked into the sanctuary wearing only one, a scandal the pastor's wife managed to contain, with a compliment that, Alice told me later, was the kindest form of gossip she had ever witnessed. I could pawn those pieces all day and never buy back a single Tuesday afternoon from 1983, and so I don't, and I won't, and it is possible that the only truly adult decision I have made lately is to keep them safe where sunlight can find them, but strangers cannot. The modern world requires a man to sign his name on screens that pretend to be paper, and in my clumsy way I have complied, joining the patient parade of passwords and verifications and security questions that seem to assume our childhoods were quaint obstacle courses designed to prepare us for forgetting. I refused Facebook on principle for years, the principle being that I thought my face had earned its privacy. But the church women said I would like seeing photos of the grandchildren, and the VFW guys told me the fish fry announcements went up there now. And so I relented and created an account with a picture of my hand wrapped around a cup of coffee, which felt more honest than my face anyway. I learned that the internet can deliver a funeral and a birthday cake with equal enthusiasm. I learned that photographs have become less about what they capture and more about how quickly they can be deployed to prove a thesis, usually the thesis of happiness. I learned that you can be lonely in a room full of people or on a screen full of smiles, and that both kinds of loneliness require the same remedy, which is, unfortunately, the one we are least equipped to manufacture on demand. I scroll in the evenings when the house starts to echo, telling myself that it is harmless to know that a classmate from 1965 has purchased a boat, that a cousin I never liked has become astonishingly devout, that people I do not know have opinions about everything, from airports to plums. Sometimes I comment in my head and spare them my wisdom, which is a discipline I did not possess at 30. So perhaps I am improving after all. On good days, I cook. Not the soups that come with instructions, but the dinners that require the dignity of a cutting board. And the slicing is a kind of prayer because it repeats without being mechanical. And I can imagine Alice moving around me, retrieving the colander, muttering about the stubbornness of onions, humming the melody of a song, whose name I never remember, but whose rhythm I could mark on a napkin. On better days, I leave the television off and read the biography she stacked on the nightstand, as if she knew death would make a coward of my attention, and wanted to hand me fragile courage in hard covers. The radio is reserved for the afternoons, when the mail brings a catalog of things I will never buy. And then I let the baseball game carry me through 9 innings of a narrative that has only one moral, and it is patience. And when the announcer says a player waited on that pitch, I thank him for the gift of a verb. I am not patient with everything. I am not patient with the way the bank redesigns its website every 6 months, with the way medical offices confuse distance with efficiency, with the way the word legacy has been conscripted to sell sneakers and diets. But I am patient with the past, because it is the only country in which I can still travel without a ticket. Jared calls less than he used to, which is the precise amount of less that still allows him to tell himself he is attentive. And I answer because that is who I am and always was. The man who says of course, even when the request is rude, and the asking is an indictment disguised as a favor. He says he worries about me rattling around in the house alone, and I say the house is fine company, and he says houses don't talk back, and I choose not to point out that this has been his complaint about people too. He blames costs for the distance between us, as if families are mortgage-backed securities that default when the market frowns, and sometimes I let him talk because it feels good for him to hear his own sentences form an argument. And sometimes I interrupt because I hear Alice in my head telling me that the danger with reasonable men is that they can explain away a cruelty until it looks like a budget line. After the call, I go upstairs and wind the little ballerina and watch her try, with heroic futility, to sustain the pose she learned in some maker's factory, and I forgive her for wobbling Because what else can you do when the tune is running out and your whole job is to keep turning? The truth is that I am not looking for a crisis, and I have never been the sort of man who wanted to teach his family a lesson by withholding anything except judgment, which is my one wealth. But I have come to suspect that time does its own arithmetic, that it finds the sums we have hidden in kitchen drawers and behind the polite habits we wear to the store. And when it does, it presents the ledger with a gentleness that feels like mercy, until you realize the numbers are not suggestions. There are days when I tell myself that I have been lucky, and it is true, and others when I tell myself that I have been careless, and that is also true, because I let love do the bookkeeping, and love is a generous accountant up to the very moment when it is not. Lila's wedding has become the star at the edge of my weeknights, the point toward which everyone is sailing. And if I have learned anything useful in the last 2 years, it is that a wedding can be a field where we bury old arguments, or a stage where we audition new ones, and which it becomes depends less on flowers and speeches than on whether the people involved remember the difference between inheritance and heritage. I keep Alice's ring close, in a place only my hands remember, because promises do not retire, and because there are some objects that do not belong to the realm of currency, no matter how loudly the world clears its throat, and because somewhere inside, the old lacquer box is the sound of my wife saying my name in a kitchen washed with afternoon light, and I will not sell that sound for any price. It began, as these small devastations always seem to, with something ordinary enough to disguise its cruelty. It was a Tuesday, the kind of gray Midwestern afternoon that forgets it ever promised spring, when I drove to the hardware store to replace a strip of weather seal and pick up the small bulbs for the porch light. On the way home, I stopped by the diner where retirees like me pretend to have urgent errands. My friend Walter, who once taught civics before the school board decided the subject was expendable, waved me over. He has the sort of broad cheer that makes you believe his life has been charmed, though I know from the way his eyes stall mid-sentence that his wife's dementia has hollowed most of that luck out of him. We talked, as we always do, about the brewers, about gas prices, about the way time erases one's appetite for certainty. Then he pulled out his phone, squinting through bifocals, and said, with the innocence of a man showing you a baby picture, "Jerry, you ever use Facebook Marketplace? People sell the damnedest things there." I was half listening until he turned the screen toward me, and then every muscle in my body seemed to register what my mind refused to grasp. On that glowing rectangle was a photograph I knew as well as my own reflection, a velvet-lined case with a brooch shaped like a maple leaf, the one Alice wore each Thanksgiving, and beside it the small gold locket engraved with our initials, the curve of the G still slightly crooked, because I'd carved it myself with a pocket knife in 1971, when we were too poor for jewelers and too much in love to care. The listing said, "Vintage jewelry lot, excellent condition, local pickup only," and beneath it the seller's name, J. Fenton, Jared Fenton, my son. At first I thought there must be another J. Fenton in Milwaukee, a coincidence as stupid and cruel as life can sometimes be, but the background in the photo settled the question. I could see the pattern of the kitchen countertop from Jared's house, that fake marble laminate I'd helped him install 2 summers ago when he said he couldn't afford a contractor. I stared until the diner noise went thin and far away. Walter was still talking, something about how people will sell anything these days, even their wedding china. But I couldn't hear him. I excused myself, lied about having to meet a repairman, and drove home through the drizzle with the kind of calm that belongs only to shock. The house met me with its usual sigh. The first thing I did was go upstairs, open the bedroom closet, and slide the old lacquer jewelry box forward. The ballerina's head had broken off years ago, but the mechanism still played its tired melody when I turned the key. Inside, there was nothing. Not the brooch, not the locket, not the small string of pearls that Alice wore the night we renewed our vows for our 40th anniversary. The velvet indentations were like missing teeth. For a moment I thought perhaps I'd moved them, but I knew better. The box had been closed since the day after the funeral, and only one other person had been in the house since then, Jared. I sat on the edge of the bed, the empty box on my knees, and felt the old pulse of anger rise like a fever I hadn't known I could still catch. There are betrayals that announce themselves with shouting, but the quieter kind, the kind that arrives in the absence of what you loved, strips language from you. I remembered the afternoon Jared came by last month, the first in weeks, saying he needed to borrow a ladder. He'd gone upstairs to fetch something from Mom's room, and I'd assumed it was a photograph for Lila's wedding slideshow. He came down 15 minutes later, whistling. We'd had coffee, discussed nothing. I even gave him $20 for gas. And now the image on the screen replayed itself in my mind until it blurred. I went back to my desk, turned on my computer, and typed, Facebook Marketplace Milwaukee Jewelry J. Fenton. The listing appeared again, bold as daylight, joined by another that made my throat tighten, a sapphire ring described as antique engagement piece, minor wear. The photo was poorly lit, but the shape of the stone was unmistakable. It looked like Alice's, though something in the color seemed off. Maybe the lighting, maybe my hope that it wasn't hers. I scrolled to the bottom. Message seller. My fingers hovered above the keyboard. What could I possibly write? Hello, this is your father. Is there a reason you're selling your mother's life in 2-inch thumbnails? Instead, I closed the laptop and sat in the dark until the refrigerator's motor hummed back to life and reminded me I hadn't eaten. By nightfall, I had convinced myself to call him, because the mind of a parent is a factory of excuses. Perhaps he'd taken them to have them cleaned. Perhaps his wife had listed them without asking. Perhaps I had misplaced them and was about to humiliate myself by accusing my only son of theft. I dialed his number, and when his voice came through, bright and distracted, it felt almost like reprieve. Hey, Dad, everything okay? I said I'd found a photo online that looked like his kitchen counter, that someone was selling jewelry identical to his mother's. There was a pause, short but heavy, before he said, Oh, that. Yeah, I posted a few things. We figured it's time to declutter. Mom had beautiful taste, but what's the use of keeping everything locked away? He said it as if it were a perfectly rational act, like taking out the recycling. I heard myself asking whether he'd asked me first. Ask you? He gave a small laugh. Come on, Dad. You don't wear brooches. Lila's wedding is expensive, and honestly, she'd rather have the money than a box of old trinkets. It's not like Mom's going to mind. His words came through calm, almost bored, the tone people reserve for justifying a parking ticket. I tried to tell him those pieces were promised to Lila in Alice's will, that they were not his to sell. But he interrupted. The will's just words on paper, Dad. We all know what Mom would have wanted. She'd want us to be practical. Practical. That word again. The polite mask of greed. My hands were shaking, though my voice refused to rise. I told him to take the listing down. He said he couldn't. Someone had already made an offer. Besides, he added, it's just stuff. You're getting too sentimental about things. You always do. After we hung up, I stood in the hallway staring at the framed photo from Alice's last birthday. Jared is in that picture, his arm around her shoulders, smiling the same smile he used to con me into believing this theft was efficiency. I wanted to call him back, to say that sentiment is the name we give to the pieces of love we cannot spend. But the phone stayed in my hand like a weapon I wasn't brave enough to use. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept opening the marketplace page, refreshing it as if the listings might vanish if I stared hard enough. Instead, new comments appeared. Still available? Is the sapphire genuine? The brooch sold first, then the locket. The ring remained unsold for a day, then the photo changed. The case was gone, and only the ring sat on a folded napkin beside a cup of coffee that looked suspiciously like the one on Jared's kitchen table. I could almost smell the cinnamon he sprinkles on top, a habit he mocked me for until his wife decided it was cozy. I closed the computer, went to the kitchen, and poured a drink I didn't want, because there was nothing else to do with my hands. Somewhere between midnight and dawn, I walked into the garage, opened the old trunk where I keep spare tools and forgotten paperwork, and pulled out the folder that held Alice's will. The envelope was empty. The document that had once declared her wish to pass her jewelry to Lila was gone. I stood there in my robe under the single bulb, surrounded by the smell of oil and cold metal, and for the first time since the funeral, I said her name out loud. It came out as a whisper, a question, a prayer, all at once. The echo settled into silence like dust. In the days that followed, I functioned with the stiff precision of a man pretending nothing had happened. I mowed the lawn, answered the phone when the insurance company called, nodded to neighbors. But inside me something had shifted. Not merely anger fades, but the dull certainty that my own child had translated my love into liquidity. I kept thinking of the last time Alice wore the sapphire ring, the evening before her first hospital stay. We had been sitting at the kitchen table, the radio murmuring an old Sinatra song, and she reached across to squeeze my hand, her skin already thinner, the veins like fine blue lace. "Promise me," she said, "that when I'm gone, you'll give this to Lila on her wedding day. Every woman should have one thing that carries a heartbeat." I promised, and I kept that promise in the small way that was left to me. Months before her death, I had taken the real ring to a jeweler, asked him to make a near-perfect replica so Alice could keep wearing it even as her fingers swelled and shrank from medication. The duplicate was slightly lighter, the stone a fraction paler. I told no one. The original I hid in a place no one would think to look, the hollow beneath the false bottom of an old music box in my desk drawer, the one that played a tune so warped it was more memory than melody. Now, as I listened to the faint creak of the house around me, I realized that small act of superstition had become a form of justice. Jared thought he had sold his mother's heart. In truth, he had only auctioned its shadow. And though I did not yet know how, I sensed that the reckoning between us had already begun, quiet and inexorable, like the first stir of thunder over the lake. For several days after that call, I lived as if under a bell jar, moving through my own house with the deliberate quiet of someone afraid to startle a ghost. Every drawer I opened seemed to accuse me of carelessness. Every photograph was a reminder of the slow arithmetic of loss. I told myself that the jewelry was gone, and that the lesson was simply another harsh installment in the education of being old, an age when the people you created start editing your history for you. But pretending to forgive does not cure humiliation. It only buries it where it ferments. On Friday morning, I drove to Jared's neighborhood under the pretense of bringing a box of old photographs for Lila's wedding video. The truth was that I wanted to see his face, to measure how guilt looks on a man who believes he has done nothing wrong. His house stood at the end of a cul-de-sac, where all the mailboxes were painted a uniform beige by the Homeowners Association. an arrangement that suited Jared's preference for appearing ordinary. His wife, Melissa, opened the door, startled, wearing the smile people reserve for door-to-door preachers. "Dad, what a surprise," she said, which was another way of saying, "We would have preferred advance notice." Behind her, I could see the gleam of the granite countertop, the same one in the photograph from the online listing. I asked if Jared was home. She hesitated, glancing toward the living room, then nodded. "He's just finishing a call. Come in." The house smelled of lemon polish and the faint chemical sweetness of air freshener. I set the box of photos on the coffee table and waited, noticing that every surface was carefully curated. Family portraits in coordinated frames, a vase of artificial lilies, a stack of interior design magazines. When Jared came out of his office, Bluetooth still in his ear, he looked mildly inconvenienced, but not surprised, as if my appearance had been penciled into his schedule as an unpredictable variable. "Hey, Dad," he said, offering the half-hug of a man protecting his personal space. "What brings you here?" I told him about the photographs, about wanting Lila to have a few genuine moments from her grandparents' life. He nodded, distracted, flipping through the top of the pile. "Nice," he murmured. "We'll scan them." I watched him for a long moment, then asked quietly, "Did you sell all of Mom's jewelry?" The words hung between us like a bad smell. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he poured himself coffee from a stainless steel carafe and took a measured sip before saying, "Dad, we've already been over this. They're just things. Lila needs a future more than she needs a jewelry box full of nostalgia." His tone had the forced patience of a customer service representative handling a difficult caller. I said her future would have been brighter with a clean conscience. He laughed, sharp and short. "Conscience doesn't pay for venues or catering. You can't hang morality on a bride's neck." I felt the tremor in my hands and clasped them together to still it. I told him he had no right to touch those things, that his mother had wanted them passed to her granddaughter, that they were part of our family's history. He shrugged. "History is expensive real estate, Dad. We can't live there forever." Melissa had reappeared in the doorway, pretending to tidy up, but her eyes were fixed on me with the weary alertness of someone monitoring a volatile patient. Jared's voice softened as he turned to her. "It's fine, honey. Dad's just sentimental. He misses Mom." That simple sentence, so clinical, so dismissive, cut deeper than the theft. It reduced 43 years of marriage to a psychological symptom. I told him he could think what he liked, but that he would not disgrace her memory further. He smiled thinly. "You always make it sound so dramatic. Maybe you should try to let go. Mom's gone. The jewelry's gone. None of this matters." I wanted to strike the smugness off his face, but instead I walked to the window and looked out at the manicured lawn. The neighborhood children were riding their scooters in circles, their laughter bright and distant. The ordinary beauty of that moment made me ache for all the ordinary things that had once belonged to us. I turned back and said, "If it doesn't matter, then why do you look afraid every time I mention it?" He froze for a second, then laughed again, louder. "Afraid? Of what? Come on, Dad. Don't start imagining conspiracies." I left without another word. On the way home, I drove past the pawnshop district on the south side and saw the kind of stores where widowers sometimes sell their guilt. Out of morbid curiosity, I parked and went into one. The clerk was a heavy-set man with tattooed arms and a polite detachment that comes from seeing too many small tragedies. I described the brooch and the locket, pretending I was a collector, and he nodded thoughtfully before flipping through a ledger. "Sold last week," he said. "Guy said they were his mother's. Paid cash." He showed me a photograph from the intake file, and there was Jared's signature on the receipt. My chest tightened, but I thanked him and left. The afternoon had turned bright and windless, the kind of deceptive calm that sometimes precedes a storm, and I stood on the sidewalk feeling as though the city itself had taken on Jared's voice. Reasonable, dismissive, hollow. When I got home, I poured a glass of water and stared at the ring of moisture it left on the table, thinking how quickly evidence evaporates. The empty jewelry box still lay open on the bed. I closed it and locked it, though locking emptiness is a pointless gesture. That night I dreamt of Alice standing at the end of the hallway, not angry, just watching, her eyes full of the silence that comes after disappointment. The following week, invitations for Lila's bridal shower arrived in the mail, embossed and perfumed. I almost threw mine away, but then decided to attend. I wanted to see whether guilt had any visible manifestation. At the event, held in a converted barn with string lights and mason jars, Jared played the role of the proud father, toasting his daughter's happiness. When he hugged me for the photographer, his hand pressed lightly against my back, as if guiding me toward invisibility. Lila looked radiant, unaware of the undercurrent, or perhaps unwilling to confront it. She came over and said, "Grandpa, Dad told me you found the old jewelry box. I'm sorry if it upset you. He thought you'd given those things to him." I nearly laughed. "Did he now?" I managed to keep my voice steady. She nodded, adding that she'd asked for one piece to wear at the wedding, her grandmother's ring, but Dad said it had been damaged years ago. "He said you replaced it with another one that wasn't real sapphire," she said apologetically, as if the detail might embarrass me. I smiled and told her not to worry, that I would see what I could do. In that moment, the idea of quiet revenge began to form not out of spite, but out of a deep, exhausted love for truth. If Jared believed he had rewritten the story, I would show him that some chapters refused to be erased. After the shower, I sat in my car for a long time, watching the guests scatter into the parking lot, listening to the laughter recede like the tide. I realized that humiliation doesn't end when others stop talking. It ends when you reclaim your own voice. I went home and opened the secret compartment of the music box, touching the real sapphire ring, feeling its cool certainty against my palm. It seemed to pulse faintly, or maybe that was my own blood acknowledging it. I could almost hear Alice's laughter again, the way she used to say, "You always think you can fix people, Jerry. Sometimes you just have to let them reveal themselves." Well, Jared was revealing himself now, in full daylight. The next morning he called, sounding falsely cheerful, to tell me he'd arranged a payment plan for the wedding photographer and might need to borrow a little to cover the deposit until after the event. His voice was buttered with casual confidence. I said yes automatically, the old reflex, and when he thanked me, I could hear him exhale with relief, as if the world had been restored to its rightful order. But when I hung up, I didn't write a check. Instead, I went to the bank and transferred the requested amount into a separate account under my control, labeling it Alice's Legacy. It was not vengeance yet, merely preparation. Days turned into weeks. Jared and I maintained the polite fiction of civility, exchanging short calls about logistics, seating charts, and catering choices. He mentioned selling a few more family antiques online, mostly furniture I hadn't seen in years, and each time I swallowed my anger like medicine too bitter to spit out. The more he talked, the clearer it became that he saw the past as raw material, to be liquidated, its sentimental value measurable only in market rates. Meanwhile, I noticed how he avoided meeting my eyes whenever we were in the same room, as though some small, unacknowledged part of him feared the reckoning he didn't yet believe would come. In quiet moments, I imagined what Alice would have said if she could see him now, her only son treating memory as merchandise. I thought of the countless evenings she had defended him when he was young. He's just finding his way, Jerry, be patient. And how patience, misapplied, can become complicity. One night, after another hollow conversation, I poured myself a glass of brandy and sat at the kitchen table with the jewelry box beside me. The ballerina still turned, slightly off balance, and the music, thin as thread, filled the room. I realized that for all Jared's talk of practicality, what he had really sold was not gold or gemstones, but the unspoken belief that family was sacred. That, I decided, was something he would have to buy back at a price of my choosing. When the wedding date drew closer, invitations to the rehearsal dinner arrived, embossed with gold lettering and the same careless luxury that had funded itself on Alice's keepsakes. I RSVP'd yes. In the margin of the card, I wrote in neat, unwavering letters, "I will bring a gift that belonged to your mother." It was not a threat. It was a promise to myself. The days leading up to that night were a strange mix of dread and anticipation. Each evening I opened the music box, looked at the ring, and rehearsed in silence what I might say when the moment came. I knew Jared expected me to give Lila something symbolic, perhaps one of the imitation pieces he believed were all that remained. He had underestimated the stubbornness of a man who has lost everything once and refuses to lose the truth a second time. The first escalation, I realized, had already occurred, the quiet transformation of grief into resolve. I was no longer the father who waited for apologies. I had become the custodian of a legacy that would speak in its own time. And though Jared still moved through the days with the confidence of a man who thinks he owns the narrative, I could feel the story shifting beneath us, patient as gravity, inevitable as debt. When dawn came, I was still sitting at the kitchen table, the thin gray light settling across the counters like dust. The shoebox of pill bottles open beside me, each container lined up like evidence at a trial I could not yet imagine how to win. I had not slept, only drifted through hours that stretched and folded in on themselves, replaying the dinner, the ambulance, the doctor's face, as he said coagulation, and the dull thud of my heart when I realized that proof, not truth, was what the world believed in. I poured myself coffee I couldn't drink, its bitterness matching the metallic echo still clinging to my tongue. Outside, the neighborhood moved on as if nothing had happened. The newspaper thudded onto the porch. The neighbor's sprinklers hissed to life. And for the first time in my long life, I understood what it meant to stand completely outside the pattern of the ordinary. My daughter lay in a hospital bed, and I could not decide whether I wanted her to recover so she could explain herself, or not recover so that the explanation would die with her, and I would never have to hear the shape of the thought that had lived behind her eyes while she stirred my food. By mid-morning the police returned. A different officer this time, older, his voice less bright with procedure. He carried a clipboard, and behind him another man in gloves took photographs of the kitchen and labeled the freezer bags with tidy numbers. The officer asked if I was feeling well, if I'd eaten anything since the incident, and I said no. I hadn't been hungry. He said the hospital had found traces of a strong anticoagulant in Melissa's blood, the same class as my prescription, though in quantities inconsistent with medical use. He paused, waiting to see if I'd flinch, as if expecting me to confess that I'd dosed her in revenge. I kept my voice calm, almost steady, and told him what I knew, that the gravy had been served separately, that I had switched the plates, that I believed the contamination, if that was the right word, had been meant for me. He wrote this down slowly, his pen pressing deep grooves into the paper, and then asked whether I had anyone who could confirm my state of mind before the event. It was a polite way of asking if I was delusional. I told him about the pharmacist, about the pill bottles that didn't match, about the messages on her phone, though I could see skepticism flickering across his face like light behind clouds. I offered the phone to him, explaining how I'd found it, what it said. He examined the screen, photographed it, and returned it without comment. Then he said they'd send the food to a lab, and that I should stay reachable, and that he hoped I'd get some rest. Rest, as if sleep could bleach away what I now knew. After they left, the house felt stripped bare, as if the act of official scrutiny had emptied it of warmth entirely. I wandered through rooms that suddenly looked staged, my own life arranged by a stranger. Every framed photograph seemed to accuse me of something, either of failing to see what Melissa had become, or of seeing it too late. I found myself standing in front of a picture from her wedding day, her hand on her husband's arm, her smile wide and bright. I remembered how proud I'd been that day, how certain that I'd done my duty as a father. Marjorie had whispered that she didn't trust the groom, that his charm felt rehearsed, and I'd laughed it off, saying all men rehearsed their charm when they were young. Looking at that photo now, I realized Marjorie had seen something I hadn't, the same calculating gleam that later surfaced in Melissa's eyes when she thought she was unobserved. I set the photo face down on the shelf, unable to stand their frozen happiness staring back at me. Around noon, the phone rang again. It was the hospital. The nurse said Melissa was conscious and asking for me. For a moment, I couldn't answer. My throat closed up, and I thought of pretending not to be home, but some stubborn instinct pushed me to go. Maybe it was duty. Maybe it was the need for the final piece of the puzzle. Or maybe I wanted to hear her voice one more time before deciding what to do with the rest of mine. I drove in silence, the car's old engine humming like a low prayer. The hospital parking lot shimmered under a pale sun. Inside, the corridor smelled of antiseptic and loneliness, and the sound of rubber soles squeaking on linoleum followed me to her room. She was propped up in bed, pale but alert, her hair tangled, her eyes wary. When she saw me, something like relief flickered across her face, followed quickly by confusion. "Dad," she said, her voice dry, "you came." I nodded and sat down in the chair by her bed, keeping my hands folded in my lap because I didn't trust them not to shake. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The heart monitor beside her chirped steadily, counting out time in small electric pulses. Then she looked at me, her lips trembling slightly. "They said there was something in my blood," she whispered. "They said it was the medicine you take. How did that happen?" Her tone was not accusation, but inquiry, soft, coaxing, as though she still believed she could write the story faster than I could tell it. I met her gaze and said, "You tell me." The silence stretched. She blinked, looked away, then back again. "Dad, I don't know what you mean." Her fingers plucked at the blanket, twisting the edge until it frayed. "I only wanted to help. You've been forgetting things, mixing up your pills. I was worried. Maybe I made a mistake. Maybe I—" She stopped, her eyes darting toward the door, as if measuring whether someone else was listening. "You didn't make a mistake," I said quietly. "You made a choice. There's a difference." For the first time she looked frightened, not of me, but of the calm in my voice. "Dad," she began again, "I was trying to protect you. You've been getting worse. You don't even see it. You call me twice in a day and forget you already did. You told me you left the stove on. I just thought—" "That's not true," I interrupted. "You told people it was. You wanted them to think I was losing my mind. You needed that story, didn't you? It makes what you were doing sound like mercy." Her eyes filled with tears, quick and sudden. "Please," she said. "You don't understand. Thornton said we couldn't keep doing this forever. The bills, the house, everything. It's too much. I thought, if something happened to you, the insurance, the inheritance. Dad, I wasn't trying to hurt you, I swear. I just wanted it to be peaceful, quick. You wouldn't even know." The words slid through me like cold water. She covered her face with her hands, shaking. But there was no sobbing, only the dry rhythm of guilt rehearsed too late. I felt no triumph, only a hollow ache. "Peaceful," I repeated. "You were going to make it peaceful." I stood up, feeling older than I had that morning. "Melissa, I need to tell the police what you just said." She lowered her hands, panic flashing across her features. "No. Dad, please. They'll think I'm a monster. You don't want that. You're all I have left." "You had a mother once," I said, the bitterness sharp in my throat. "She would have died all over again if she'd heard you say that." I turned to leave, but her voice stopped me. "Wait," she said, almost shouting now. "It wasn't just me. Thornton knew. He told me what to use, how much. He said he read about it. He said you'd never notice." Her voice cracked. "He said he couldn't stand waiting for you to die naturally." I froze, one hand on the doorframe, the world spinning in slow motion. It wasn't just her. Of course it wasn't. I had seen his influence in her for years. The way she parroted his tone, his dismissive smile. But hearing it confirmed, hearing that he had been the architect of my death disguised as her caretaker, shifted something in me that I couldn't yet name. I turned back and looked at her, my daughter, my only child, the sum of all the years I'd thought were love. "Then you should both be ready to answer for it," I said. She began to sob in earnest then, her face buried in the blanket, and I walked out before she could stop me. Outside, the sun was blinding. I stood on the steps for a long time, letting the heat burn away the chill that had settled in my bones. I called the officer handling the case, told him I needed to speak in person. He met me at the station that afternoon, and I told him everything. Her words, her confession, the husband's name. He listened, took notes, asked questions that I answered without hesitation. When I finished, he exhaled slowly, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Mr. Pierce," he said, "we'll investigate. We'll need to verify everything. But if what you're saying checks out, this is serious. Serious." As if the word could hold the weight of what had happened. He asked if I felt safe returning home. I laughed then, quietly, the sound startling even to me. "Safe?" I said. "I haven't felt safe in months. I just didn't know why." He nodded, offered to have a patrol car swing by my house at night for a few days, but I waved it off. The only thing I wanted was to sit somewhere still and understand the wreckage of what remained. That evening, I drove to the lake where Marjorie and I used to walk in the summers, the same place where Melissa had once learned to skip stones. The air smelled of pine and algae, and the water was perfectly still, reflecting the pink smear of sunset. I sat on a bench, watching the ripples from a passing duck, and let my mind wander through the years. How had we come to this? Had I been blind, or had love itself acted as a kind of blindness, softening every warning into coincidence? I thought of all the times I had said yes when I should have said no, all the checks I'd written, the small humiliations I'd swallowed because she was my daughter and I wanted to believe she was good. Love, I realized, isn't just what we give, it's what we permit. And I had permitted far too much. When darkness fell, I drove home. The house waited in silence, patient as a predator. I locked the doors, though I wasn't sure from which side danger might come any more. I sat in my chair by the window, watching the lights of passing cars flicker across the walls. Somewhere inside, a part of me began to harden, not out of hatred, but out of a need to survive the knowledge that forgiveness would be impossible. I thought of Melissa's tears, of her saying peaceful, and I understood that in her mind she had already rewritten the story, cast herself as the caretaker overwhelmed by circumstances, not the conspirator who had tried to end her father's life. The world would likely believe her version. It always believes the living before it believes the old. But I had something stronger than belief now. I had truth, and the strange, steady calm of a man who has nothing left to lose. Before bed, I walked into the kitchen and poured the 2 freezer bags' contents into separate glass jars, labeling them again, this time in careful ink. I set them in the refrigerator, not for the police, but for myself. A reminder that sometimes survival is not about strength or faith, but about the single, quiet act of noticing when the hand that feeds you is trembling for the wrong reason. Then I turned off the light, stood for a moment in the darkened room, and whispered to the empty air, "Marjorie, I think you'd be proud. I finally learned to see." The rehearsal dinner was held in a restored vineyard outside Madison, one of those places that tries too hard to look rustic, with wine barrels repurposed as tables and Edison bulbs strung like memories no one really owns. I arrived a few minutes early, as old men tend to, dressed in my only dark suit, the one I wore to Alice's funeral. It still fit, though the shoulders hung looser now, as if grief had trimmed me down to the essentials. The evening was warm, but restless. A low wind kept whirring the edge of the white tablecloths. I stood for a moment at the entrance, watching guests scatter through the courtyard, holding glasses of Merlot and laughter in equal measure. Jared was everywhere, clapping shoulders, posing for photos, adjusting his cufflinks in that small mirror-polished gesture of vanity he'd picked up from somewhere. When he spotted me, he waved with exaggerated warmth, that politician's gesture that forgives everything without ever admitting fault. "Dad, you made it," he called, striding over with a grin too wide to trust. "You look sharp. Lila's going to be thrilled you're here early." I nodded, said something polite, and noticed how his eyes darted briefly toward the small velvet box in my hand, before returning to my face. He tried to mask the flicker, but it was there, the fear of discovery disguised as curiosity. He ushered me toward a long table where the family was gathering. Lila looked radiant, flushed with that particular brand of happiness that believes in permanence. Her fiancé, Daniel, a quiet boy with a banker's posture, stood beside her, dutifully cheerful. Melissa, ever the mediator, hovered like a diplomat, ensuring that no one mentioned unpleasant topics. We exchanged greetings, each one polite, rehearsed, and hollow. Jared introduced me to a few guests I didn't recognize. Business partners, old college friends who laughed too loudly, each wearing the thin film of success that never quite hides anxiety. One of them, a man with an expensive watch, mentioned casually that Jared's consulting firm had been killing it lately. I smiled and said nothing, knowing that killing it was precisely what my son had been doing to everything that once had a soul. During the toast, Jared raised his glass and thanked everyone who made this day possible, listing sponsors of happiness in the tone of an auctioneer, to family, to love, to practicality. The last word slipped out naturally, and a few guests chuckled, assuming it was a joke. I caught his eye and saw that he knew I'd heard it for what it was, a taunt wrapped in civility. After dinner, as twilight softened the edges of the vineyard, Lila came to me, her face glowing with that open sincerity I had loved since she was a child. "Grandpa, I'm so happy you're here," she said, slipping her arm through mine. "Dad said you have something special for tomorrow. You don't have to. Just being here is enough." I smiled. "It's a small tradition, sweetheart. Your grandmother would have wanted it." She rested her head briefly on my shoulder. "I miss her," she whispered. "Sometimes I think she'd be disappointed in how everyone argues about money." The confession startled me. "You know about that?" I asked. She shrugged. "I hear things. Mom and Dad think I don't, but I do. I just wish they'd stop pretending that everything's perfect." Her voice trembled with a maturity she hadn't earned but had inherited by necessity. I squeezed her hand. "Perfection's overrated. Tomorrow's about love, not the rest." She smiled faintly. "Then let's make it about that." As she walked away to join her friends, I realized that the ring in my pocket was no longer just an object of revenge. It was a compass pointing back toward decency. The next day dawned with the kind of clarity that always unsettles me. Sunlight too sharp, as if the world were being freshly scrubbed for inspection. The ceremony was set outdoors beneath an arbor draped in white roses. Guests arrived in their polished versions of joy. Photographers orbited like insects around sugar. I took my seat near the front, surrounded by distant cousins and acquaintances, who smiled at me with that polite curiosity reserved for the elderly, living relics from a vanished generation. Jared moved through the crowd like a host in his own kingdom, shaking hands, offering quick jokes. When he reached me, he bent slightly and said in a low voice, "Let's keep everything simple today, okay? No speeches that might embarrass anyone." The implication hung between us like smoke. I looked at him evenly. "I've never embarrassed anyone, son. Truth usually handles that on its own." He straightened, forced a smile, and walked off. The ceremony itself unfolded with mechanical grace. The pastor's words about unity and legacy floated harmlessly above us. I watched Lila walk down the aisle on Jared's arm, her face luminous, and for a moment even my anger softened. Alice would have wept to see her like that, a living continuation of everything gentle she'd ever believed in. When the vows were exchanged and the applause rose, I clapped too, though my hands felt heavy. During the reception that followed, the air grew thick with music and wine, the chatter of people congratulating themselves for attending love's performance. I waited, patient as a fisherman, until the moment came for the speeches. Jared, predictably, insisted on going first, tapping his glass for silence. His words were polished, rehearsed, and hollow. Gratitude for guests, admiration for the couple, a few strategically placed jokes about married life. Then he gestured toward me. "And now, my father, the man who taught me everything about dedication and, well, practicality." A ripple of laughter followed. I stood slowly, feeling the weight of the room's attention settle like a physical pressure. I didn't have notes. I didn't need them. I began by thanking the guests, the hosts, and the couple. Then I spoke of Alice, how she'd loved this family, how she believed that love without respect is just sentimentality dressed in Sunday clothes. I said that she had left behind not riches, but reminders, small objects that held her laughter, her decency, her belief that beauty was a form of gratitude. I could feel Jared stiffen across the table, his jaw tightening. "Before she passed," I continued, "she asked me to give something to Lila on her wedding day, a symbol of faithfulness, of what endures when fashion and fortune fade." I took the small velvet box from my pocket and opened it. Gas fluttered through the room as the sapphire caught the light. "This was your grandmother's ring," I said, turning toward Lila. "She wore it for 43 years, through everything that tested her. She wanted it to remind you that love isn't measured by cost, but by what you're willing to keep safe." Lila's eyes filled with tears as she reached out her trembling hand. I slid the ring onto her finger. "It's perfect," she whispered. Jared managed a smile, but his eyes betrayed confusion, an uncertainty that lasted just long enough for me to recognize it. He knew something was wrong. He just didn't know what. After the applause and the toasts, when the crowd dispersed into dancing and laughter, Jared cornered me near the bar. His smile was gone. "What was that?" he hissed under his breath. "You said you'd given me all the jewelry months ago." I took a sip of my drink before answering. "Not all of it, apparently." He blinked, thrown off by my calm. "Is that—" He stopped, lowering his voice further. "Dad, tell me that's not the real one. You can't possibly—" I looked him in the eye. "It's hers, Jared. It always was. Some things don't belong to thieves." The color drained from his face. "You can't talk like that here," he whispered, glancing around. "People will hear." I smiled thinly. "Then maybe they'll finally listen." He grabbed my arm, fingers digging in harder than necessary. "You've got no idea what you're doing. You're humiliating me in front of everyone." I pulled free. "No, son. You did that yourself when you sold her memory for pocket change." His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Behind us, the band struck up a new song, and laughter rose again, muffling the tension. He turned away abruptly, muttering something about needing air, and I watched him stride toward the edge of the courtyard, shoulders tight, a man retreating from his own reflection. Later that night, after most guests had left, Melissa approached me. Her face was pale, eyes rimmed red from drink or from dread. "You shouldn't have done that," she said quietly. "He's furious." "About what?" I asked. "About being seen for who he is?" She shook her head. "You don't understand. Things are complicated. Jared's business. He's under pressure. There are debts, investors. Selling those things wasn't just greed. It was desperation." Her voice broke. "He thought he could fix it before anyone knew." I stared at her, the puzzle pieces sliding into place. "So that's it," I said softly. "He didn't just sell our memories for money. He sold them to cover lies." Melissa looked down, ashamed. "He didn't mean to hurt you. He doesn't know how to stop pretending." I wanted to hate her, but her honesty disarmed me. "Then maybe it's time he learned," I said. She wiped her eyes and walked away, leaving the faint scent of roses behind her. For the first time that night, pity joined my anger, and the combination was almost unbearable. The next morning, the newspapers carried the usual social blurbs about the wedding, glossy photos of smiles that had cost more than most people's cars. Jared's grin beamed from the page, but to me it looked brittle, like paint beginning to crack. I folded the paper neatly and placed it beside the music box on my desk. The ballerina inside still turned, slower now, as if even she were weary of repetition. I thought about what Melissa had said about debts and pretense. It didn't excuse him, but it explained the hunger behind his cruelty. The revelation, though, didn't soften my resolve. I decided to visit him one final time, not to accuse, but to settle accounts. When I arrived at his office, the receptionist hesitated before letting me in, as though she'd been instructed to guard against intrusions of conscience. Jared was on the phone, his voice tight, brittle, with forced confidence. He waved me to sit without pausing his conversation. "I told you, the numbers will even out next quarter," he said. "We're restructuring, that's all." When he hung up, he slumped briefly, then straightened. "Dad, now's not a good time." I looked around at the office. Expensive furniture, a wall of framed certificates, a view that screamed ambition. "How much did you owe?" I asked quietly. He frowned. "What?" "The money. How much did you sell your mother's things for?" He laughed without humor. You don't get it, do you? This is business. You think everything's about morality, but sometimes survival means compromise. Survival of what? I asked. Your reputation? Your illusion? He stood, pacing. You wouldn't understand. You never had to fight for anything. The words stung, absurd though they were. I fought for decency, I said. Turns out that's the only thing worth the bruises. He stopped pacing and looked at me with sudden intensity. I can't keep this up, Dad. The company's falling apart. I tried to fix it. Selling that jewelry, it was supposed to be temporary. I thought I could buy it back before anyone noticed. He rubbed his temples, the mask slipping. And now you've made it impossible. I felt something shift inside me, a weary compassion mixed with disgust. You made it impossible the day you forgot who you were, I said. But you can still fix what matters. He looked up, desperate. How? Everything's gone. Not everything, I said. Your daughter still believes in you. For her sake, start telling the truth. He stared at me, eyes rimmed with panic. You've already taken that from me, he muttered. They all saw you. You made me look small. I sighed. You did that yourself, son. I only turned on the light. I left him sitting behind his polished desk, staring at nothing. In the weeks that followed, word spread quietly that Jared's firm had folded. Some clients withdrew, citing instability. Others simply stopped answering his calls. Melissa moved back to her sister's place for a while. Lila, bless her, tried to keep the family from unraveling entirely, inviting me over for Sunday dinners where the air was heavy with the effort of pretending normalcy. Each time I saw her wearing Alice's ring, I felt both pride and sorrow. The sapphire caught the light like an unblinking eye, reminding me that justice, when it comes, is rarely loud. Jared stopped calling altogether. I heard from Walter that he'd taken contract work out of state, something about restructuring another firm, though whether he was rebuilding or hiding, I couldn't tell. I didn't rejoice. What had started as vengeance had turned into something smaller but more enduring, a quiet reclaiming of dignity. I kept the music box on my desk, winding it occasionally, letting its warped tune fill the room. Sometimes, when the light hit the lacquer just right, I could almost see Alice's reflection in it, smiling not in approval, but in understanding. Months later, a letter arrived from Jared, handwritten, the first in years. The envelope was plain, the handwriting careful, as if he'd forgotten the rhythm of sincerity. Inside was a single page. Dad, I don't expect forgiveness. You were right about everything. I don't know how to be the man you wanted, but I'm trying to remember the one Mom believed I could be. I hope Lila makes you proud. Tell her the ring is beautiful. Tell her it's real. Love, Jay. I read it twice, then placed it in the same drawer as Alice's old wedding certificate. It wasn't absolution, but it was acknowledgement, and sometimes that's the best the living can offer the dead. I sat by the window until dusk, listening to the quiet. Somewhere outside, a storm was building again, low and steady. I found myself smiling, not with triumph, but with the relief of completion. The past had finally stopped shouting. What remained was silence, vast and clean. The kind that comes only after everything false has been stripped away. In the end, it did not arrive with a slammed door or a courtroom or the sudden violence of some stranger's temper. It arrived the way big weather does in the Midwest, with a long low pressure that sets every window to humming before the first drop falls. And it was Lila, of all people, who gave the storm permission when she called one Sunday afternoon and asked if I would come to a small supper at her apartment, because she wanted to bless the new place with the people who actually make me feel safe. And when she said her parents would be there, her voice did not falter. It simply thinned a little, as if she were speaking across a longer distance than the phone could measure. So I said yes, and spent the next 2 days doing what practical men do when they are about to be brave, which is to gather papers and proof instead of courage. And I laid everything out on the dining room table, with the deliberate hands of a bookkeeper balancing the last page of a long ledger. The jeweler's letter from years ago certifying the existence of the second ring and noting the microscopic flaw that distinguishes the original. A printed copy of Jared's marketplace listings with the countertops and the timestamps and the comments from strangers who had bartered for my wife's memory. A photocopy of the relevant paragraph from Alice's will. The one that names Lila and calls the jewelry an inheritance of character, in the careful legalese that cannot quite hide how human it is. A receipt the pawnbroker had allowed me to photograph, more out of pity than policy. And finally, the documents I had signed that morning at the bank, the ones that moved the money I had set aside under the quiet name Alice's Legacy, into a simple, irrevocable trust for Lila, with language so plain even grief could not misunderstand it, along with a separate notarized memorandum stating, for anyone who might someday challenge it, that the sapphire ring now on Lila's finger was her property free and clear of all claims. And just before I left, I placed the old music box on top of the stack. Not because it proved anything to anyone, but because some truths deserve to be sung even when the tune is crooked. Her apartment was on the second floor of a building. Young people pretend is vintage because the pipe's grown and the stairwell smells faintly of onions. And inside she had arranged a narrow table with mismatched chairs and sprigs of green in old jars. The kind of humble beauty that would have made Alice nod with satisfaction. And when I arrived, Melissa was already setting plates with the careful efficiency of someone who cannot stop doing, even when doing has become the mask she wears to step around pain. And Jared stood by the window rehearsing a smile, the one that says we are civil people and therefore nothing truly unforgivable has happened here. And after the first small talk decayed into the clatter of silverware, I placed the stack of envelopes beside my plate as one might set down a box of tools in a room that keeps insisting it does not need fixing. And I waited, because age has taught me that sometimes the kindest way to begin is to let the other person take the first step into their own confession, which Jared did by clearing his throat and saying he had been thinking about properly insuring the ring I had given Lila, and that the policy would require he hold it for a short while to get it appraised through the firm his company used. A firm, he added quickly, that specialized in legacy items, and he spread his hands as if to show how empty of malice they were. And I saw Melissa flinch as if she could already feel the weight of what those hands had lifted before. And Lila, who had been pouring water, set the pitcher down with a gentleness that struck me as more adult than any sermon, then reached across to touch my wrist, as if to ask silently whether now was the time. And I told her yes with a nod, because the house inside my chest had never felt so ready to be swept clean. I began the way you begin, when you choose not to humiliate, but to reveal, by telling a story so ordinary it cannot be argued with. The story of Alice at the kitchen table on a Tuesday in October in 1971, and the ring that caught the square of light that always fell through the window at that hour, and how I promised her with the arrogance only the young can afford that I would keep that light safe. And then I told them how years later, when illness had made her fingers change size, and the world seemed full of small betrayals, no one had ordered, but everyone had to deliver. I bought a second ring as a kindness to her comfort, and a precaution against the sort of future I was afraid to name. And I slid the jeweler's letter across to Lila, who read it, with the expression people wear when they discover a map of a place they knew by heart but had never seen drawn. And then I slid Jared the printouts with his listings and the pawn receipt and the date stamps that did not need commentary. And for a long breath he simply stared at the paper as a child stares at a test he cannot pass, without admitting to himself he did not study. And when he finally looked up, his face had the drained color of plaster before paint. And he said he knew how this must look. But it was not what I thought, that he had been under pressure, that he would have made it right, that if I had not blindsided him at the wedding, none of this would have blown up. And I said, as quietly as a man says anything when he has no anger left to spend, that the only thing that had exploded was the fiction that love can be tallied as a temporary loan. He began to speak faster, the way some men run when they sense the ground beneath them has remembered gravity. And he said he was the father here, and I was undermining him in front of his child, and he needed the ring only for a week to secure a short-term bridge he had arranged with people who were depending on him. And the word depending made me think of Alice leaning into my shoulder after chemo. And I reached for the music box and wound it and let the thin song thread the room. And in that warbled melody was every afternoon of our marriage and every Sunday dinner and every tense silence that had been purchased on credit. And then I slid the trust documents to Lila and said that I had already done the only insuring that mattered, that her grandmother's ring now belonged to her and to no ledger, that a small fund bearing Alice's name would help her build whatever quiet life she and Daniel chose, without anyone ever making her feel she had to sell her memories to pay for the table she ate at. And if she preferred, a portion of it would, on her instruction, be used to fund scholarships for caregivers at the oncology ward who held hands in the dark when families could not find words. And before Jared could answer, she placed her other hand over mine and said that this was the first thing in months that felt like love, instead of management. Melissa spoke then, not to defend or to accuse, but to confess, saying she had known about the listings and had been afraid to stop them, that fear had turned their marriage into a company with 2 exhausted employees, that she had told herself it would end when the crisis passed, and had not noticed the crisis had become the way they breathed. And as she spoke, Jared's anger collapsed into something uglier and smaller, the tight, sullen silence of a boy who sees the belt coming, and he reached for Lila's hand and said he was still her father, and as such he had certain rights. And Lila, who has her grandmother's soft voice and iron spine, took back her hand and said she was not property, and neither was the past, and that there would be no more signatures made in her name. And then she turned the ring gently on her finger, and for the first time since the wedding, I saw Jared understand what the word irrevocable feels like when it touches skin. I told him I had filed no charges and intended to file none if he chose to turn toward the truth, rather than invent a version that would buy him 1 more month of pretending, but that I had notarized a statement of fact and placed copies of everything in a folder at my attorney's office that would remain sleeping as long as he did, and that my will had been amended and no longer required him to feel the weight of my estate or my expectations, and that this was not punishment but relief, because sometimes mercy looks like taking a burden out of the hands that insist on turning it into a weapon. And he said something about betrayal and how a man cannot be cut out of his own father's life like a bad sentence. And I said I was not cutting, I was closing. The way you close a door in a winter storm to keep the house warm for those who are shivering inside. And then I pushed the last envelope across the wood, the photograph from the pawn intake, his signature in a hurried tilt that no longer resembled his childhood hand, and it lay there between us like a mirror. Neither of us wanted to recognize. The music box wound down and the room held its breath, and in that pause I felt Alice as distinctly as if she had entered with her coat unbuttoned and her cheeks flushed from the cold. Not to pick sides, but to insist on a standard. And I heard myself say the most expensive sentence I've ever spoken, which was that I loved my son and would not finance his forgetting, and that if he wished to begin again, he was welcome to start not with an apology, but with a day at the oncology ward bringing coffee to tired nurses, and the next day a call to the pawnbroker offering to buy back anything he hadn't yet resold to strangers, because sometimes all you can do is reverse the most recent harm, and that if he did those two small things, and then chose the third, telling his daughter the whole truth in one unbroken sitting, I would meet him for dinner, and we would discuss men's work and how to do it without trading our souls for an extension. He stood then and moved toward the door as if the room had become uninhabitable for the kind of story he prefers to tell himself. And at the threshold he turned, mouth opening and closing on sentences that could not quite assemble, and for one brief unguarded second he looked like the boy who once scraped his knee on our driveway and stared at the blood as if surprised to discover what he was made of. And he whispered, "You didn't have to do this here." And I said softly that there was no other place left where the words would be heard by the people who had the right to hear them. And then he went down the stairs, with footsteps that sounded like a man walking away from an office that has just told him to clear his desk, and Melissa followed more slowly, promising to call, and Lila and I stood there in the thin aftermath and let the silence find its level. Later, after the dishes were done and the papers tucked away and the city had folded itself into the hush that comes just before midnight, I sat in my car with the music box on the passenger seat and turned the key not to start the engine, but to wind the spring one more time. And the little ballerina made her brave broken circle, and the old tune broke and mended and broke again. And I leaned back and let the sound peel the day away until only the shape of what mattered remained. And I understood in a way I had not managed at the wedding that the climax of all this was not the moment of public embarrassment or even the restoration of a ring to the finger it was meant for. It was the quiet transfer of authority from the liar to the truth, from a son who mistook inheritance for capital to a granddaughter who understood that some objects are just containers for vows. And when the song ended, the air felt clean and a little cold. And I said her name into the dark and told her that the house was warm. The windows were latched. The lights were low. The ring was home. And the ledger, at last, balanced. The weeks that followed were slow and strangely hushed, as if the air itself had been wrung out. I had expected the aftermath to feel like victory, a clean wind sweeping through the ruins, but it felt more like standing in the quiet after a long argument when no one is sure who has won or whether winning was ever the point. The house seemed to breathe differently. The clocks ticked with a steadier pulse. The evenings were less frantic in their silence. I spent most mornings on the porch with my coffee, watching the neighborhood resume its small rituals, dog walkers, paper boys, the mail carrier's van idling in front of the Johnsons. The world, indifferent and competent, kept going, and I found comfort in that. Grief had taught me the language of stillness, but now, for the first time, I began to understand the grammar of endurance. There is a difference between surviving and continuing. One is defense. The other is permission. I realized I had spent 2 years surviving Alice's death, Jared's betrayal, the collapse of our name into embarrassment, and that morning, under a sky washed pale by early autumn, I gave myself the simple, radical permission to continue. Lila called often, always starting with the same question. "Are you eating enough?" As if nourishment were the proof of recovery. She and Daniel had settled into their new apartment, and she spoke about repainting walls, adopting a cat, saving for a trip to the coast. The ring, she said, fit perfectly. Sometimes, when she felt nervous or tired, she would turn it slowly around her finger and feel calmer, as though it carried its own heartbeat. That pleased me more than I expected. It meant the object had resumed its rightful function, not as a treasure, but as a small, durable reminder that love could survive dishonor if it found new custodians. Once she told me she'd visited the oncology ward where her grandmother had been treated and given flowers to the nurses. I wanted them to know we remember, she said. I didn't tell her that this small act was the truest form of inheritance I could have imagined. I only said she made her grandmother proud. And I meant it. Melissa called too once, her voice cautious and brittle. She said Jared had taken a consulting position in Ohio, that he was trying to start over. I said I hoped he succeeded, though I didn't ask for details. There are kinds of forgiveness that exist only as distance. She thanked me for not ruining him publicly, as though mercy were a favor rather than a necessity. Before hanging up, she added quietly, "He carries that pawn receipt in his wallet now. Says it reminds him who he doesn't want to be." That image stayed with me for days. My son walking through some other city, every billfold a folded confession, a portable lesson in loss. It wasn't redemption, but it was movement in its direction, and sometimes movement is enough. As for me, I began to clear the house, not to sell it, but to make space for the kind of silence that doesn't accuse. I donated clothes, boxed books, organized the attic into neat rows of labeled bins. In one of them, I found an envelope Alice had written in her looping script, for later, when later feels possible. Inside was a single sheet of paper, her handwriting shaky but defiant. "If you're reading this, it means you've done your best, and it was enough. Promise me you'll stop trying to turn everything painful into a project. Some things heal only when you let them be beautiful instead of useful." I read it twice, folded it back, and laughed, an unfamiliar light sound that startled me. She had known me too well. She had anticipated my instinct to make meaning out of damage. I left the letter on the mantel and stopped planning what to fix next. Autumn settled over Milwaukee with its usual modesty. The days shortened, the leaves burned themselves into color, and the evenings brought that particular melancholy sweetness that always made Alice hum under her breath. I started walking again, longer routes this time, past the lake and into the park where we used to sit on weekends. Sometimes I brought a thermos of coffee, sometimes a book I never opened. The act of being outside, of breathing air that hadn't passed through the filters of my own loneliness, felt like permission granted by the world itself. Occasionally I would catch a glimpse of young couples on benches, heads close together, phones glowing between them, and I would think about how love in every generation invents new disguises, but the ache underneath stays the same. I no longer felt angry watching them. Instead, I felt a kind of tender curiosity, as if observing a language I once spoke fluently, but now only understand when the vowels stretch a certain way in the cold. One afternoon, as the first snow hinted in the wind, I drove to the cemetery. I hadn't been in months. The path was slick with leaves, the grass brittle. I brought nothing, no flowers, no tools, no rehearsed words. I sat beside her stone and spoke to her as if she were in the next room. I told her about Lila's new cat, about Melissa's tentative peace, about Jared's self-imposed exile, about how the house had grown quieter but kinder. I admitted that sometimes I still woke expecting to hear her in the kitchen, that the smell of toast could still undo me. I told her I'd kept my promise about the ring, that the right hands had found it, that the family's heart was still beating even if it had changed rhythm. And for the first time since she died, I felt her answer, not as words or wind, but as an easing, a loosening of the knot I had been carrying behind my ribs. It was as if she were saying, "You did what you could, Jerry. That's all love ever asks." When I stood to leave, I noticed the faint glint of the lake through the trees, a flash of blue so similar to the sapphire that I almost laughed. The world, it seemed, had decided to echo her one more time. I drove home without turning on the radio, content with the quiet hum of the tires and the rhythm of my own breathing. Dusk gathered as I parked. Inside, the house smelled of dust and something faintly sweet. The ghost of polish from the woodwork, perhaps. On the table, the music box waited. I wound it gently, and for once the melody didn't sound broken. It sounded aged, tempered, like something that had learned how to live with its cracks. The ballerina turned in her small orbit, steady and unhurried, and I watched her until the tune wound down. Then I whispered, "Thank you," though I wasn't sure to whom. Perhaps to her, perhaps to the life that had insisted on going on. That night I slept without dreams, and in the morning I woke to sunlight filtering through the curtains in the same soft color as the ring sapphire. The kettle whistled, the floor creaked, the newspaper thumped against the door. Everything ordinary was restored to its rightful scale. I realized that the story was finished not because justice had been done, but because silence no longer hurt. When I looked at the empty chair across the table, I didn't see absence anymore. I saw space, the kind that waits for new laughter, new beginnings, or just another cup of coffee, cooling slowly beside an old man who has finally learned the difference between keeping and holding on.